All right. Hello, hello, hello. Greetings to everybody. My name is Chris Bench. I am a professional SAT and ACT tutor, among other things. And I'm here to talk about some standardized testing. I want to talk about the PSAT, the SAT, and the ACT. More on the latter two, on the SAT and the ACT, but I do want to address the PSAT at least a little bit. Because it is good to know about, and I generally tend to think that students hear less about it and so understand less about what's going on with that test. I'm going to do a little bit of screen sharing right now. As I talk, if you have any questions, you should feel free to put them into the chat. We're going to be watching out for those to make sure that we address them along the way. As long as I'm at it, before I go sharing my screen, I'm gonna put a link to a Google Drive document. So this is gonna be a link to the slideshow that's going to be, in the background that I'm gonna be working from for the presentation. You can then have that as a resource, go back, use it as a reference ongoing. That's going to be in the chat right there. I'll mark that. Slideshow. There we go. Here today to talk about the PSAT, the ACT, and the SAT. Hopefully, you all should be seeing my screen here. I want to talk about the PSAT first. PSAT is a test that's usually administered towards the beginning of high school. It's oftentimes referred to as the PSAT NMSQT, NMSQT, if you're into the whole brevity thing. That QT actually is maybe a little bit more useful than the PSAT. PSAT just stands for pre-SAT, pre-scholastic aptitude test. The NMSQT, that means National Merit Scholarship Qualifying Test. And why that's more important to know is that the most important thing about the PSAT is that it allows you to be eligible for a whole range of different scholarships. There's the National Merit Scholarship itself, which is a major national scholarship, as the name suggests. It's given out to hundreds and hundreds of students. But most importantly, many different organizations, including many colleges, have scholarships that they give out based on your performance on the PSAT. It's a weird thing. They give you this test like the beginning of high school, more or less, that can potentially save you thousands and thousands, maybe tens of thousands of dollars. And a scholarship, 4 years down the road when you're in college. It's strange that they bank so much on something that happened so early in your scholastic career, but I don't make the rules. I just try to explain them. The PSAT is usually going to be administered through your school, at least. So I should say for everything pretty much that I'm going to talk about, at least in the early parts of this exam, there's a big ol' asterisk on all of this, and it's COVID. I'm going to explain how things normally work. We're going to talk about at the end how things might vary based on the fact that it is a strange year. I'm sure you've noticed. But usually the PSAT is administered through the school. You just come into school one day, classes are canceled, you go to the gym, the cafeteria, whatever big room they can squeeze you all into, and you sit down and take a test for 3 or so hours. It's usually given to 10th and 11th graders, most often 11th graders sometime in the fall. Sometimes kids, particularly if you've been in some sort of gifted or high performing type program, will get the test earlier in 8th or 9th grade. If you do take it earlier in like middle school, that's not going to count for the scholarships down the road. You have to take it in 10th or 11th grade for it to count for those scholarships. There is a test date coming up real soon. October 14th is the next one. That's going to be across the entire country. They tend to do these things all at once so that they, can just give the same test to everybody and not worry about y'all trading answers on the internet. You don't need to register for the PSAT. Your school will do all that for you. Again, this is assuming that things are operating in a normal circumstance, which, you know, more asterisks. There is an alternate PSAT date this year that was just added, like actually in the last week or so. It's going to be in January, on January 26th. Schools may opt to do that if there are health concerns for the October date, hoping that by January things will be better. Whether or not things are going to be better in the middle of winter for a respiratory pandemic, who knows? I have some suppositions, but that's a different speech. Your PSAT score does not go out to colleges. I want to repeat that. That score, it'll get sent out to the scholarship people. It will affect what kind of scholarships might be eligible for down the road, but that does not go to colleges. And the scoring on this is just downright silly. So the test is broken into two main sections. There's basically a math section and a verbal section, much like the SAT, for those of you that know a little bit about how the SAT is broken down. For reasons that no one has ever been able to explain to me adequately, scores on the PSAT, they range from 320 to 1520. Why they couldn't pick a round number, I don't know. And that's coming half from math, half from verbal. So you can get between 160 and 760 on math, 160 and 760 on verbal. Those scores, again, they combine to get your composite score. That big sort of top line score is probably the number that you want to pay most attention to, though. A little bit about the format of the PSAT. And one thing that's really nice about the PSAT, and they do this intentionally, is that it really is a pre-SAT. The format on the PSAT is almost identical to that on the SAT. The sections occur in the same order. The kinds of questions that you're going to encounter are very similar to the SAT. They do this so that they can familiarize you a little bit more with it and prep you for the SAT, but also because they don't want you to be taking their competitor's test, the ACT. So the reading portion, the first section on the PSAT is a reading test, is going to be comprised of 5 passages. One of that's going to be a paired passage. So it's like 4 regular passages. And these passages are a few hundred words in length, usually take you a few minutes to read them. The paired passage is 2 shorter passages that are related to each other, usually by different authors. You get 60 minutes, 1 hour, to answer questions, 47 questions about those 5 passages. The reading section here tends to be a little bit more challenging, tends to be sort of like higher high school reading level, maybe even like freshman year college reading level type assignments. Something that you might find a little challenging. On the PSAT, a little bit, even more on the SAT, there's some archaic language. You might get passages from a novel that's 100 years, 200 years ago written. You might get excerpts from historical documents, people fighting in Congress about slavery or about independence. There's a lot of stuff that focuses on American history. You'll see passages about the sciences, about the social sciences, hard sciences. So you could see a passage theoretically about the fact that they may have just identified life in the atmosphere of Venus. Probably not in the upcoming test, but down the road. Or you might see a passage on social science focused on something like how economics relates to different cultural phenomena. Wide range of different topics, ranging from anytime really. I've seen passages as old as the 18th century, so 200-300-year-old passages in some cases, though most of the language will be from the 20th century. So that's a reading section, first section, first hour of the test. The second section of the PSAT, the writing section, you're going to have 4 passages. These passages, they're shorter, they're tighter, they tend to be written all in contemporary English. They're usually not as confusing to follow. The reading passages, they're there to really sort of test what the limit of your comprehension is. The writing section, by contrast, they expect you to sort of understand what's mostly going on in those passages. They're really there to test your knowledge of grammar, your knowledge of good writing conventions, your ability to think about the organization of a piece of writing. your ability to think about, just what are the rules of good writing. That's a shorter section. It only lasts for 35 minutes, bit of a relief after that long reading section that starts things off. It runs 44 questions. It's the fastest part of the test. You really got to be answering those pretty whip quick. So that's the first half of the test, the verbal part of the PSAT. The second half of the test, the math part of the PSAT, is split into two sections. There's a no calculator section, 25 minutes, 17 questions, and a calculator section. You're allowed to bring your calculator. There's a list of them. You can search for PSAT calculator. The large majority of calculators are allowed in the PSAT and the SAT. Really, the only kind of calculators that are not allowed is anything you got to plug into a wall, or things where you can program in equation solving. That you find lists of them online. Search for PSAT allowed calculator. It'll spit back the list. I don't have it memorized, but usually it's not a problem. The calculator section runs 45 minutes and is 31 questions. The difference between the two is in some cases pretty minor. The no calculator section will test your ability to do some of that like stuff from elementary school that you may have frankly kind of forgotten about a little bit. You might have to do some long division. You might have to multiply some like large numbers together. It's stuff that we rely on for our calculators. I reach for my calculator on stuff like that. But it's stuff that you should also know how to do if you need to longhand, just so that you remember the underlying principles behind it. The SAT and the PSAT both include gridding questions. So for the large majority of all the tests that I'm talking about, most of these are multiple choice. Good old-fashioned Scantron, fill in a bubble sheet. Hopefully y'all are familiar and have done them a million times. But the SAT and PSAT do include a small number of what are called gridding questions, where you need to enter in, they don't give you multiple choices. You need to enter in a number that is the answer to the question out of any possible number in the world. So in some cases, that's going to change your approach to problem solving a little bit, because you can't really work the answers in the same way that you can with math problems where you have multiple choices to decide between. Again, the PSAT is going to be almost identical to the SAT. So pretty much everything I just said, I'm going to repeat in a little bit more concise fashion in a couple of minutes when I talk about the SAT. But this general layout, first the reading and writing, that verbal section, then the two math sections are going to comprise the main form of the thing. All right. So that's the PSAT. Now I want to start talking about the SAT and the ACT. The SAT and the ACT. This is going to be our main focus for the evening. The SAT and the ACT, the reason that you take these tests, the reason that they administer these tests, is to provide colleges with a gauge for understanding what your preparedness is for college. This is the main overarching purpose. The reason that they have these standardized tests is that different schools have sort of different levels of difficulty. Some schools, like everybody gets an A. Some schools don't even have grades. Some schools, everybody's failing. Some schools have really hard curricula. Some schools have really easy curricula. The PSAT and the ACT offer colleges a way to compare students with a sort of by a standard metric that everybody has to take. Now there are good things and bad things about that, and I'm happy once we get to the Q&A at the end to talk about those pros and cons of standardized testing at a sort of higher level philosophical sort of level. But at the moment, I just want to sort of help you work through it, because the fact of the matter is that it's a reality that you're going to have to deal with, whether or not it's a good reality or a bad reality. What I want to talk about right now, though, is the relative importance of different admissions criteria. So this is a study taken a few years ago. And again, we're going to talk about how COVID has changed all this down the road. But you'll note that the first 3 different criteria that schools look at in evaluating prospective students is grades in college prep courses, grades in all courses, and just how hard is the curriculum at your school. how hard are the courses that you chose to take. These, pretty much all the colleges think that this is extremely important. 80% like think it's considerably important where your grades in college prep courses. 60-some% for the grades in all other courses. Just behind those grades at 55% are these SAT and ACT courses. And again, that is because it provides them with a means of sort of comparing kids from lots of different schools from all over the country, without having to give a whole lot of thought to, what the nature of the school is that they've been attending. Lots of other things that are on this list here, everything from your essay to class rank to what do you hold down a job in your free time? All those things also on the list, but somewhere a little bit below standardized tests. All right, so the SAT, this is our first main college test that I want to talk about. So the SAT, again, very similar format to the PSAT. Usually the SAT is not just straight administered through your school. Many schools do offer an in-school SAT day. Again, whether or not those are going to be happening is a big old question mark this year for all the obvious reasons. But you need to contact your school district to tell you whether or not that's going to happen. Too many school districts out there to speak to exactly what's going on. But your school district will be able to tell you that. Usually juniors and seniors take the SAT, either juniors in the spring of their junior year or seniors the fall of their senior year. There are 4 primary test dates. So this is 4 test dates that aren't given out by the school that you would have to register for online. Significantly, the upcoming test date on September 26th, today is the last day to register for that September 26th exam. So, if you are thinking of taking that September 26th test and you have not yet registered, as soon as we're done here, you beeline for the College Board, the SAT website, and make sure that you get registered. I will say significantly, so we got these 4 dates here. These are going to fill up fast if they are not already filled up in your areas. A lot of kids from the spring who tried to take tests in the spring and got delayed because of the pandemic and are now set to take them in the fall. These have been filling up much more quickly. If you are a senior and have not taken your SAT or ACT, please sign up ASAP as soon as this program is over, basically. Because your opportunities to do so in the future are going to be very limited. So you see the dates up there. Again, you'll have this. You have the link in the chat, so you'll have this as a reference. These tests do go out to colleges. These tests do go out to colleges. Your colleges will see these. You get to choose which colleges see these, and in some cases, you actually get to choose what parts of the tests the colleges will see. We can talk about that a little bit later down the road. And the scoring on these is a little bit different. It's still, frankly, stupid, but it makes at least they picked round numbers. The scores go from 400 to 1600. That's with 200 points coming from the verbal side, 200 to 800 points from the verbal side, 200 to 800 points from the math side. So at least some round numbers. Similar scoring to the PSAT. But just slightly higher numbers. The test is divided, much like the PSAT, into 3 parts. We've got that first initial reading section. Here, the reading level is going to be a little bit harder. Pretty much everything's going to be college level texts. There's going to be 5 passages, one of which is going to be those paired passages, and it's a little bit longer, 65 minutes, 52 questions. Writing section, similarly, it's going to be more high school level prose. The prose is going to be a little bit easier to figure out what's going on, but it's going to be a lot faster, 35 minutes, 44 questions. So again, you got under a minute per question to be reading this whole thing and thinking through what's going on. And then again, the math section, you've got a no calculator section, a shorter one, 25 minutes, 20 questions, followed by a longer section, 55 minutes, close to an hour, 38 questions. And again, you have those non-multiple choice grading questions. So I actually want to pause real quick here. I don't know if I can see the chat at all. Can I see the chat? Chat. See if anybody has any questions thus far. It does not look like. Again, if you have any questions as I'm going, please feel free to pipe up in the chat, and I will try to keep an eye on that so that I can try to address them along the way. All right, rolling along. So that's the PSAT and SAT. The other major college application test is the ACT. Traditionally, the SAT has been more popular on sort of both coasts, and the ACT has been more popular in the center part of the country. That has changed in recent years. Illinois is actually more commonly giving out the SAT right now. And we have actually a question in the chat, which I'll pause real quick. Can you only take the PSAT and the SAT once? So because the PSAT is administered through your school, students typically just take it once. Honestly, the most common exception to that is kids that were in sort of gifted or enrichment programs in like middle school and took the test super early before it even counts for anything. And then take it again at the normal time at the beginning of high school. The SAT you can take again and again. So it's not necessary. It might be through your school, but usually people take it by going online and registering it and taking it on the weekend. Sometimes it'll be in the school, or sometimes it'll be elsewhere. I know actually right now there's a lot of hotels that are, because they don't have any guests. So the SAT people are renting out like whole hotels, and then are administering things in different rooms. But you can sign up to take those SAT multiple times, and really I'm going to talk about this down the road, particularly if you are a student for whom stress and test anxiety is a big concern. Signing up for multiple exams can be a really useful tool in your toolkit, so that you know that the whole world isn't riding on this just one 4-hour marathon exam. You get multiple 4-hour marathon exams, but at least it's not just this one time. You've got a couple of different opportunities. I know when I was in high school, typically kids just all took it in the fall. That's what I did. Now it's much more popular to get try taking it once or twice in the spring of your junior year. Partially just to get it out of the way. I mean, your senior year, your fall semester, there's just a lot going on. College applications take a lot of work. You're taking intensive classes. It's coursework that the colleges are all going to see. So if you can just get it out of the way in your junior year, spring of your junior year, I would encourage you to sign up for it early there, and then have the opportunity to take it again down the road. Summer SATs and summer SATs and ACTs are becoming increasingly common. They're starting to schedule more of those. Obviously, that opportunity has passed for this year, but for those of you who are younger, you'll have that opportunity also. It is possible to take the exam too many times. Most kids, it doesn't, it's not an issue. But if college is looking, you've taken the test like 7 times and your score never really went up, they're going to register as like, hey, we really do know that this is kind of what seems to be the limit of this kid's performance. Whereas if you take it once or maybe twice, they might be a little bit more willing to give you the benefit of the doubt. All right, so I'm going to go back to the ACT and talk a little bit more about the ACT. Again, designed for juniors and seniors, spring for the juniors, fall for the seniors. A few test dates here coming up in the fall. And again, the October 10th one is the next one. The deadline for that is September 25th. So once again, it's coming real fast. Goes out to colleges. Scores on the ACT are still a little screwy, but are somewhat less screwy. Scores range from 1 to 36 is your total composite score. And the way that they get that number 1 through 36 is that the ACT is broken down into 4 sections: writing, math, reading, and science. And each of those 4 sections, you get a score of 1 through 36, and then they just add them up and take the average of those 4 scores to give you the composite score. Still don't know why they can't do round numbers. I don't know. They didn't ask me. But a little bit easier to follow than the SAT, I tend to think. Certainly more than the PSAT. So a little bit about the format. Like I said, there's 4 sections. There's the English or writing section. That looks a lot like the writing section from the SAT. There's going to be 5 passages, 45 minutes, 75 questions. This is, again, the fastest part of the test. You really got to be answering these quickly. But also the reading level here is going to be more high school texts, not as challenging as the reading sections. And they're really just testing your grammar, your ability to think about things like organization, conventions, tone, rhetoric, all these sorts of things. After that comes the math test. The math test. Math test is 60 questions in 60 minutes, which hopefully you guys are good enough math students to means 1 minute per section. The timing on that is actually a little bit different. We'll talk about timing down the road, just given the top line right now. But the reading test is the third part of the exam. Here you've got 4 passages, and they are going to be a more challenging bunch of passages than in the English section, more college level. Usually a little bit less likely to get the archaic language than the SAT. So one thing that you might want to think about when you're choosing, which test you want to take, if you're really, really not great with older language, pre-20th century language, for example, 19th, 18th century language, you might want to trend towards the ACT because it is a little bit more contemporary. And then the science test, which is 6 passages, in 35 minutes, 40 questions. Whereas the SAT, the science stuff is sort of spread throughout the whole thing. The ACT has a specific science section. And that specific science section is, it's actually not really so much about science, which is something we'll talk about down the road. But it is, again, broken up into 6 passages, 35 minutes, 40 questions. Both the SAT and the ACT have essay sections that you can complete at the end. They are optional in both cases. The PSAT does not have an essay, but both of them we'll also talk about in a few minutes. All right. Well, right now, in fact, I should know the organization better. So these optional essay sections. You want to ask yourself, should I take you're probably asking yourself, should I take these essay sections? I tend to think that it's best to take the essay sections. Oh, somebody's. How much does it cost for redoing the SAT? I don't actually know the cost off the top of my head. And so the practice SAT, so you do not sign up for the PSAT, the pre-SAT. Your school will do that for you. The actual SAT, you just want to go to the SAT website, just punch in SAT test website. There'll be more links down the road, but you can just search for SAT test website. It'll take you there, and there'll be instructions for signing up there. And I apologize, I should know how much it costs off the top of my head, but oh, Nicole says 68 with the essay. It's a little bit cheaper if you do it without the essay. I tend to think that most students should take it with the essay, unless you know exactly which schools that you're going to be applying to, and you've confirmed that none of those schools require the essay. Because the absolute last thing that you want to do is take the SAT, take the ACT, nail it, get a great score, be super happy, and then realize that you want to apply to a school that requires an essay and then have to go and redo the entire thing. Because you can't go in and just take the essay. You got to redo the whole thing just so that you can get that essay score under your belt. And I'll be talking about practice tests down the road from the question that we just got. The SAT essay runs 50 minutes. Significantly, neither of these essays have that regular sort of middle school prompt where you just like state a thesis and then have like 3 points of support afterwards. They're both a little bit screwier than that. The SAT essay focuses on rhetorical analysis, which is just a fancy way of asking you to think about how a writer makes their argument. So they present you with some essay by some writer, and you're supposed to look through and say like, okay, how is this writer trying to convince me of their argument? One thing that you do not want to do if you're taking the SAT essay is say whether or not you agree or disagree with it. That's not what the essay is about. They don't care whether you agree or disagree with this author. They want to know whether or not you can explain how the author is trying to make their case. What are the arguments that they're presenting? Why are those arguments supposed to be effective? If you learned about logos, ethos, and pathos, the 3 Aristotelian rhetorical modes, which they probably didn't call them that, but if you learned about those 3 fancy Greek terms in your English classes, these would be a great, those would be great lenses through which to analyze that passage. The ACT essay, by contrast, does ask you to take a position and defend it, but unlike that middle school essay, they're going to provide you with 3 different positions that you might potentially take and ask you to sort of compare and contrast and situate yourself between those 3 different essays. Again, what you don't want to just do is come forward and say, hey, I believe X. I believe that we should have reparations, and then not address the non-reparations or the limited reparations positions that they're also going to advance. You want to make sure that you address these different positions and talk about them in relationship to each other. All right, rolling along. So one thing that I get asked a lot is whether or not you should take the SAT versus the ACT. Couple of just to run down the differences again. The SAT has this calculator and no calculator section, whereas the ACT, you're allowed to use a calculator throughout the math section. The SAT has these grid-in non-multiple choice math questions, whereas the ACT is entirely multiple choice in the math section. The SAT does not have a specific science section, whereas the ACT does have a specific science section. On the SAT, the reading passages, they tend to be a little bit longer. The language tends to be a little bit harder. That said, the time on the SAT to do those reading passages is longer. On average, you have up to about 13 minutes per passage on the SAT sections. It's a little bit more leisurely in the reading section. The ACT is a lot faster. Kids that read slowly and struggle to get through the whole reading section in a timely fashion and under the clock are going to struggle more in the ACT reading sections than they are on the SAT section most of the time. The SAT also has what are known as paired evidence questions, which are these sort of specific annoying questions that ask you to find evidence for the last question. They're going to ask you some general question about the passage, and then we have follow-up question that asks you where in the passage, which lines does the evidence for that come from. These are probably the most difficult questions in the SAT reading section, and you're not going to see those on the ACT. You will see them on the PSAT, which if you remember those from the PSAT and you're like, man, I hated those where they ask you what line number, you might want to think about the ACT because they're not going to turn up there. And then there's the 2 different kinds of essays, one focusing on the rhetorical viewpoints with the SAT, one focusing on relationship between different viewpoints on the ACT. The best way, though, the absolute, forehead-slappingly obvious best way to decide which of these 2 tests you should take is to sit down and take a practice test of each and see what your scores are. These are sort of like general things to know, but really you can't know for sure until you try to take one of each and just see where you're at. And there's lots of different, you go online and find SAT, ACT score comparisons. There's plenty of websites that'll give you sort of metrics by which to do that. And I'm going to talk about down the road where you can find practice tests so that you can do that if you're interested in so doing. All right. So I want to go into a little bit more detail on some actual strategies for dealing with these different tests and some of the sections within them. First, I want to look at the English and the writing sections. They come up with there are different names on the 2 tests. Their format is very similar, though. Timing-wise, you get about 8 minutes for each of the passages that you're going to look at. Some kids will try to save time by not really reading the passages and just going from question to question as a terrible approach. I've honestly never met a student for whom that was a good approach. because a lot of these questions really require you to understand what's going on in the passage to understand what it is. Some questions are just about like punctuation and pure grammar, but a lot of the questions you really do have to have some decent comprehension of the passage. So if you're just skipping from question to question, you're not going to be able to do that. So please, please, please do read the whole question as you're going. Most of these questions, particularly the ones related to grammar, you can do kind of by ear, hopefully. You kind of need to because you have so little time on this section. That said, if you were looking for a really, really good score, sort of, the top line in the 30s or above 700 score, you need to also have the formal grammar knowledge to back it up, because they are going to specifically throw questions at you, where just having a sort of good ear for grammar is not going to be enough. The single most useful piece of advice I can give you for the English section, and this is, again, particularly if you're looking for a really high score, but really across the board, is to, whenever you come across a new question, and this is like the only question that example question I'm going to have the entire thing, but whenever you come across a new question, the first thing that you want to do is identify how the answers differ from one another. Go through the question, find the exact difference. So here we have an example. It's actually from a passage that's about the miniature rooms over in the Art Institute. Maybe some of you have seen them. But you can see in a punctuation question like this, the difference is the difference between like a semicolon here and a comma here and a colon here, or an apostrophe in some cases versus no apostrophe. If you're just moving real fast through these questions and you're not looking through to discriminate real carefully, these things look very, very similar. Cannot tell you the number of students where the answers, the only difference was like the words then and than. And if you're just skimming along real fast, then and than are basically the same word. Same thing with like began or begun, just one little vowel shift. Going through and asking yourself, how do these answers differ from one another as the very first step to answering any one of these questions is going to allow you to more precisely then analyze what are the things that make it right and what are the things that make it wrong? What are the relevant rules that apply in this situation? And how can I really focus my thinking here to get beyond just like what sounds good? The reading section. So the reading section is probably actually the hardest section to really improve your score. And that's because so much of it depends on reading comprehension. And reading comprehension, where you can learn grammar rules, you can learn new math concepts, and then you've got them in your back pocket. You're like, hey, I know what the quadratic formula is. I can whip it out and lay it down on the test and just, know it. Knowing how to read is something that you kind of like gotta build into the very fiber of your being. And the very best way to improve your reading score is to just read hard books in your free time. Read books that challenge you, where you don't always completely understand what's going on, but you got to work to figure it out. There's just no real substitute for that. You can practice and get better on the reading section, but the only way that you're going to do it, improve it dramatically is to read more challenging books over for the long term. Laurel points out that your librarians can help you with book recommendations. Librarians love book recommendations. This is also the section of the test where timing is most different between the SAT and the ACT. On the ACT, you have 8 minutes per passage, whereas the SAT, you have this longer 13-minute stretch, almost twice as long per passage. That said, the SAT, the language does tend to be more challenging. One of the best ways to improve your comprehension, though, on a sort of short-term basis, just by improving your test-taking technique, is that when you're reading these passages, you want to mark them up. You want to look for things like thesis statements. You look for things like keywords or character names. You find a keyword, circle that sucker. You find a thesis statement, underline it. Put notes in the margins. Label the paragraphs. Mark these suckers up. Because doing so, it accomplishes a couple of things. One, it's going to be a roadmap back through the passage when it comes time to go back and look and try to find information. And two, it's just going to keep you more engaged. Some of these passages, I'm going to be real now, they're not super exciting. They're pretty dull. So to get through them, if you turn into a conversation, if you're asking yourself questions about what's going on, if you're constantly trying to, engage with the text in different ways so that you can annotate, so that you can be like, oh, this is the paragraph about this thing. This is the sentence. This is the topic sentence. Oh, here's the definition for this term. If you're constantly going back and making those sorts of marks, you turn into a back and forth. and you're gonna be less likely to zone out, which happens to literally all of us. So underline thesis statement, circle keywords, create character lists if you're in a fiction passage, you know, make sure, oh, this is the mom, this is the son, this is the girlfriend, whatever, you know, label them out so that you don't get them confused down the road. The trickiest thing about the reading section, improving the reading section, is the fact that because it is such a, like a deeply felt skill, everybody does it differently. So when I'm working with my students, with my 2Ts, the first thing that we do when we're working on the reading section is we try out a bunch of different reading strategies. We'll just try reading it through regularly. We'll try reading the questions first. We'll try just reading the first half of the passage and then skimming the second half of the passage. We'll try just skimming the whole passage and not really reading it. We'll try a bunch of different strategies to see what works for that individual student. It's like find a pair of shoes that fits. You know, it's about finding the shoes that fit your individual foot. You know, your buddy's shoes, they might be a super cool pair of shoes and look awesome and fit him perfectly, fit her perfectly. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're gonna you know, cinch up on your foot the same way. Oh, on the SAT in particular, these double questions, where the evidence questions, where they ask you a question, then there's the line number follow-up question. One easy piece of advice is, as soon as you hit the SAT, a new passage, go through, eyeball them. They're real easy to spot, circle them both. And then when you're answering them, you're going to know that it's one of these paired questions. You can actually use them, leverage them against each other. You can use those line numbers in the second set of questions to help you find evidence to more easily answer the first one. And also you can use that first question to, you know, thinking about how it ties in with the passage more broadly to help anchor the second one. You always want to answer those evidence questions as a pair. You really shouldn't ever have an answer just one or the other. You should only ever have an answer to both, because you'll really want to be thinking about them as a pair of questions, as a unit to be answered together. The math section. So the math section covers everything in your math education from elementary school, and sometimes it is elementary school questions. There'll be questions about like remainders sometimes, and like kids are like, I didn't do this since like, you know, 4th grade or something. They can ask you about it, up through pre-calculus. There's some low-level trig. All of the trig that you really need to know is SOHCAHTOA. If you know SOHCAHTOA, you do not need to bring other trig to the table. And in fact, if you're trying to use high-level trig, or God forbid calculus, on this test, it almost certainly means that you are using the wrong problem-solving strategy. You really, you know, arithmetic, algebra, some geometry, a little bit more on the ACT than the SAT. The SAT is downplaying geometry lately, at least planar geometry. There's a lot of XY coordinate axis geometry. And the only real trig is going to be SOHCAHTOA. You will occasionally see some higher level trig concepts that get included, but always those higher level trig concepts will be explained in the actual question. SOHCAHTOA. So SOHCAHTOA, SOHCAHTOA. I can put it in the chat. SOHCAHTOA is the mnemonic for remembering what sine, cosine, and tangent are. And I'm not going to explain that right now just for time reasonings. But hopefully you've learned that in a sort of college algebra or pre-calc class. If you have not, there's a bajillion online resources that will will explain it to you. Okay. So the math section, both math sections in the SAT and ACT, they get harder as they go along. That is not true for the reading section. It is not true for the writing section. The math section gets harder as it goes along. That is super important for you to think about for your test taking strategy, because it means that as you progress, you're going to be less likely to get questions wrong. So some students will just like rush through the early parts of the test, going a mile a minute answering without really thinking about it so they can spend their time on the super hard questions. But it means that they did a really sloppy job on those earlier questions that they were more likely to get right. You get the same number of points for figuring out that 2 + 2 = 4 as you get for answering, problem 60 on the ACT, which is going to be probably a real head scratcher. Do not rush to the hard questions just so that you can be stumped by them and do a bad job on the easier ones along the way. One of the great advantages of taking practice tests, and again, we're going to hit practice tests down the road here. One of the great advantages of practice tests is that they allow you to get a sense for like when the test gets real hard for you, when you should sort of stop paying as much attention to trying to answer every single question, and when you should, what are the questions that if you take your time with them, you're super likely to get them right. This is particularly true for kids that are not necessarily shooting for an 800, not necessarily shooting for a 36 in the math section, but are really sort of challenged by those later problems, might be running out of time on the math section. For y'all, it's important to figure out where to cut your losses. If you're not trying to get into Harvard, and I didn't go to Harvard, I don't want to go to Harvard. Lots of people don't go to Harvard. If you don't want that perfect score, if that's not exactly what your goal is, if you're looking for something a couple of clicks down from there, what you need to do is to figure out, where is the point where you can kind of stop paying attention to some of these math questions so that you can give the time and attention that you need for the lower level questions. Now, if you are trying to, if you are shooting for Ivies, if you are looking for that perfect score, then, absolutely you need to be, on point throughout the entire thing. But know what your goals are, because that's going to help you develop a more effective test taking strategy. Your calculator. So it used to be the case that I took my SAT when I was in high school a billion years ago without ever touching my calculator. And it used to be the case that you really didn't need your calculator. And if you were using your calculator, it's probably going to be counterproductive. That is no longer the case, particularly on the SAT calculator section. There are questions that is really just like how quickly, how effectively can you do a bunch of arithmetic with your calculator? Are you capable of using this tool in an effective fashion? That said, you want to be using your calculator for calculation, not for problem solving. If you're relying on your calculator to do a lot of problem solving and, with different formulas or different graphs, it's probably actually not the most efficient way to approach problems. Usually the most efficient way to approach problems is to have that background knowledge, that content knowledge, that mastery of the content, rather than relying on your calculator to do that work for you. Also, lastly, for the math section here, don't be afraid to work the answers. Those sort of backdoor solutions where you try to look at the multiple choice answers and use them to eliminate some by plugging them back into the formula. The single most overlooked problem solving technique from the math section that I encounter over and over and over again is kids that get the formula for some line and they're like, hey, here are some points in their line. And they're asked how do you know which line these points match up with? And it doesn't occur to them that you can take the points on the line and plug them into that formula to see if it fits. Do not be afraid to take those answers and plug them into the formula, or take the formula that are in the answers and match them up with the points that they give you and see if they sync up. It is the most fundamental sort of principle of algebraic geometry. And it is therefore probably the most overlooked because it is so foundational. Kids overlook it because it's just everywhere and ubiquitous, and it gets easy to forget about it. All right. The science section. This is for the ACT only. The science section, timing is weird in the science section. The rule of thumb that I have, and it's kind of annoying, I'll be the first to admit it, is that you want to look at the number of questions on a given passage, subtract 1, and that's how many minutes that you really have for that passage. Much like the writing section, it's important that you not just skip straight to the questions. Please, I've had maybe 2 kids, hundreds and hundreds of students I've had over the years, maybe 2 of them have done better going straight to the questions. It is almost certainly the case that you will do better on the science section if you actually read the passage, figure out what's going on, and then try to answer the questions. That said, you don't need to read everything in the passage. There are going to be a bunch of charts and graphs. Take a glance at them, but you don't have to figure out every little data point. Just get a general gist of what they're trying to say. Significantly, the science section is not really about science. The content that's being presented to you will be scientific content, but like you don't actually have to know anything to do really well in the science section, or very rarely. There might be like 1 or 2 questions per exam where where it's necessary that you have extra outside content knowledge in order to answer those questions. What the science section is really about is mediation. It's about the way in which information is presented, whether it be a graph, chart, or paragraphs of information. It's asking you to be able to take information that's presented in different kinds of ways, abstract it out into your brain, and then relate it together at that higher abstract level. Now that's a lot of what goes on in the sciences, but the sciences also involve knowing stuff. And for the for the ACT science section, you really do not have to know much at all beyond, English. That said, it will certainly help you if you are familiar with some of the concepts. If you've already taken physics, the physics passages are probably going to be easier. So it can help, but it's not impossible to do anything on there without if you don't already have the background knowledge. One last piece of advice for the science section: learn to identify. So one of the passages in the science section is what's going to be called the conflicting viewpoints. Though kids often refer to it as the fighting scientists passages. They're going to be like scientist A and scientist B fighting over something. So scientist A thinks that not wearing seatbelts killed the dinosaurs. And scientist B thinks that it's the dinosaurs' refusal to floss. And they're going to have these stupid names, scientist A and scientist B. And it's going to be real hard to remember which one is scientist A and scientist B. The super obvious, but things that nobody ever does, just label these guys. This is flossing scientist. This is a seatbelt scientist. Just providing those labels for yourself to help organize the information can be very useful. And that grows out of the fact that the science section is, again, not about science. It's about the way that information is presented. And one thing that they're going to do is present information in kind of a stupid fashion, so that you have to work through it and think about it in a counterintuitive way, like not labeling what the different scientists believe. So if it's presented in a stupid way, represent it to yourself through labels, through charts, through graphs, draw lines, diagrams, whatever you got to do to make it easier to understand what's going on. All right, so a lot of questions from people. What's the best way to study for the exams? The single best way to study for these exams is to take full-length tests, full-length ACTs, full-length SATs. We're going to talk about where you can find those in a minute, under more or less test-taking conditions. So like in a quiet room, sitting upright at a desk, timed out, with a stopwatch going, phones in a drawer somewhere, terrible track lighting if you got it. Try to take these tests under as close to actual circumstances as possible. Score them out, and then the most important part, because it's not just about taking the test, the most important part is about analyzing your wrong answers. I cannot tell you how many students I've had that have just burned tests after taking dozens of these tests, but they don't go and look at their answers. You're not learning anything. You're not learning about the questions that you missed if you're not analyzing your wrong answers. Your time will be better spent thinking through the 10 wrong answers that you got on the test than taking a whole nother hundreds of questions long answer and answering all the questions that you know how to answer, because you're not learning anything there. You're not challenging yourself to figure out something new. So figure out what the right answer to those questions that you missed are. Figure out any concepts, any grammar rules, any math knowledge that you may be lacking in order to answer that successfully next time. And most importantly, once you do that, look at how the questions hint at how they should be solved. What is the information that a question puts out there in order to say, hey, pay attention to this or pay attention to that? Or sometimes to like hand wave magician style, they'll try to distract you in some questions. What are the ways that these questions either give you hints or try to disguise the proper problem solving route through them? that right there is a very hard skill to develop, but it's probably your most useful skill to have in performing well in these questions. Okay. On a bigger level, so these are sort of short-term, just studying for the test. It hopefully goes without saying, but you know, the very best thing that you can do also is just improve your overall math skills, right? Like the better your math skills are in general, the better you're going to be doing the math section. Improve your reading comprehension, work at your writing in general. These tests, a lot of what they test is just the test. I will be the first to tell you that. But that's not all that they're testing, right? Like if you don't know any math, it is real hard to walk into that math section and nail it. So the better you are in your math classes, the more attention you're paying in your third period math class, the more attention you're paying in your English class, you know, the more, you know, if you're actually finishing the Scarlet Letter and sitting down and analyzing the complicated symbolism and figuring out what the heck Arthur Dimmesdale is up to, working through that stuff is the best way to over the long term, improve your performance on these exams. Okay, so you guys asked for you got a lot of questions about where to find resources. So these are sort of sorted by their level of usefulness and reliability. Great resources include the official SAT study guide, the official ACT prep guide. These are books, you can find them on Amazon. They're about 20 bucks each, 25, something like that. And they contain a bunch of old tests. You can also find, I've got links here to, Prep Scholar has links to old exams, old official exams. So these are old SATs, old ACTs that have been, I guess, decommissioned, you could say, in order to, and freely distributed for kids to practice with. They're available on the internet, totally free and legal, all good. Most of the books being sold with practice tests are not great. The only non-official SAT and ACT test or ACT test guide, I actually haven't found a great one for the SAT other than the official one. The only other really, really top quality ACT tests that I've found are the Tutor Ted's guides, practice tests, and his guide to the ACT. That's, if it's not as good as the ACT, it's 99.9% as good. It's very, very high quality. The Barron's and the Peterson tests, which are probably the most popular books outside of the official ones, are a little bit sketchy. They're better than nothing. If you need more practice resources, they're fine, they'll help. But only turn to those if you've burned through more of the official stuff. I will also point out that there are subreddits for r/SAT and r/ACT. The subreddits are complicated places, as are many subreddits. But they do, in some cases, have really good resources on hand. You got to dig through and you got to find them. And also, you are going to have to wade through a lot of stuff that might be sketchy and actually not great resources. Also, it's weirdly bro-y. I don't know why. It's very dude heavy. I don't love it. But hopefully some of you will go out there and make them a little less bro-y. All right. Additional, so those are resources for testing specifically. So far as the actual like content knowledge, like what are the math concepts I got to know? What is the grammar that I ought to know? Not just like list of test questions. Khan Academy and Purple Math. Khan Academy actually is an official partner with the SAT and its parent company, the College Board. Purple Math, another great math resource. Their explanation of how logarithms work and how they relate to exponents is like forever ingrained in my brain. It's a great animation. I love it. Couple of grammar resources there, links for you to potentially use. Again, in the chat is the link to this whole document. You can use it as a resource. I'll repost it at the end of this spiel if you want, if you missed it the first time around. So a couple of questions that I got about dealing with nerves, test anxiety. And this is hard. There's no silver bullet for any of this. There are things that you can do. Get a good night's sleep, obviously. Eat a decent breakfast. Don't mess with your caffeine regimen. Like if you're like me and you drink coffee until 8 o'clock at night, God bless you, go for it. If you never drink coffee, this is not your day to experiment with espresso. Just do what you normally do, and don't mess with it. Some of the best things that you can do though are to know the test. Take a couple of practice exams. You're not going to be surprised by stuff. You're going to know what sections are coming next. There's not going to be any curveballs coming at you. Also know, all this spiel here, this is not that important, really, in the grand scheme of things, in the grand scheme of life. It's not the most important thing for helping you get into college. Your grades are way more important than that. Getting into the college, you can have a great college education at literally hundreds of schools across the nation. Getting into that school, it may feel like it has to be that school. There are other great schools out there at which you can have amazing college experiences. And know also that like the school that you go to actually, I mean, if all that you're concerned about, and hopefully this is not all that you're concerned about, but if all that you're concerned about is your paycheck after you graduate, go to the cheapest state school you can find and be a geology major and sell your soul to Shell Oil, because you're going to walk out of there a C student with a 6-figure income. Your major has way more to do with how much money you're going to make down the road than the college that you go to. Know that the world is not riding on this. Other things that you can do: sign up for multiple test dates. One thing that makes this really stressful for students is them thinking that the entire world depends on what they do in the next 3 hours. So make it so that the entire world doesn't depend on the next 3 hours. Sign up for a couple of different test dates. Again, this is complicated by COVID, but if you know you've got 4 other SATs to potentially perform on, then this one day, it's just leading up to the big day down the road months from now. And maybe you get that 1,600 this week and you cancel all those other test dates down the road, and so much the better for you. Other stuff, I mean, it's the oldest advice in the book, but like, breathe deep. Every 5 questions, stop for 10 seconds, close your eyes, count to 10, take some deep breaths. Goes a long way. Some people cultivate meditation practices. I don't personally meditate. My girlfriend does. She swears by it. Other people also swear by it as a way to focus. It gives them a lot of help. And it's something you got to work up to. You can't just start meditating the morning of your SAT. But even a few weeks worth of regular meditation practice can really make have a substantial effect on your sort of level of anxiety. Last one, and is one that I've found useful for many students. It's not a silver bullet, but many students, before a big test, sit down, sit in your car in the parking lot outside of your school or wherever you're taking the thing, and just free write about what's making you nervous for like 10 minutes. You throw it in the trash can as soon as you're done, burn it up, whatever. But just getting it out of your system can go a long way. Once you put it all down on the paper and you see it there and you can look at it, it's sort of just a thing that you can cast off. They've done studies on that. That is a weirdly effective way to combat test anxiety. It really is effective for many students. And I would recommend giving it a shot. Now I do want to, so we're coming up on the end here. I do want to save some time for Q&A at the end. Plus, I don't know what the situation is with the library, but I don't have anything going on after this particularly. I can stay late if there are more questions down the road. But I do want to talk a little bit about COVID and how it's affecting all this, because it is. And the first thing I want to say is that there are no simple answers for how COVID is affecting the testing situation. The biggest thing that I can say is that particularly if you are a senior right now, you're applying this year, and you are not currently registered for your exam, do it the second that you walk out of this thing, the second that you close this window. Do it now. These dates have filled up very, very quickly. Many of them are already full. I know kids in Chicago that have had to drive to Indiana to take tests. And be prepared for delays and cancellations. More of this stuff's gonna get delayed, and given what little I know about epidemiology, it is more likely that this stuff is going to get worse as the season goes on. And so, now is probably your best bet to take these classes or take these tests. A little bit about college admissions. So COVID has completely thrown college admissions on its head. Many schools have gone test optional because they recognize that lots of kids just aren't going to have a practical ability to take a test. They're not going to be close enough to a test center. In the past, this has been an option. This has been a useful tool for college admissions offices because pretty much everybody can take them. They're available virtually everywhere. But it is just not the case this year. And so the large majority of schools have gone test optional, but you need to look school by school to identify which schools have gone test optional and which are still requiring it. It's part of a larger trend. I know the University of Chicago went test optional on its own a few years ago. More and more schools are doing that, but not all schools have so far. If you are applying to University of California schools, UCLA, UC Berkeley, UC Davis, UC Santa Barbara, all those UCs, they are legally prohibited from using your test scores this year. They are not allowed because of the inequality that is produced by some people having more or less accessibility to these exams. So one more thing to know. As a rule of thumb, and this is again more rule of thumb, can't say absolutely what's happening anywhere. Generally speaking, what most admissions counselors that I've seen have said is that COVID has sort of flattened, made more level the importance. An initial chart that I showed you where hey, here's the relative importance of all this stuff. COVID's kind of made everything a little bit more equal because you might not have grades from your spring semester junior year. You might not have an SAT or an ACT score. Your class rank might meet a lot less because your school went pass-fail for a year and a half. Because of that, things like the essay, things like letters of recommendation, things like public service, one word that came up a number of times was character. Things that speak to a student's character more than purely their academics are being taken into account a little bit more than they used to. That said, if you can still take a test, particularly if you can take a test and you get a real good score, it's still probably going to help you. Probably. All these things, these are a lot of probablys, a lot of maybes, lot of possiblies going on here. Many of these changes, admissions officers, they're changes in some cases that admission officers have been sort of pushing for, wanting to pull away from standardized tests, wanting to focus more on character and these sort of like softer criteria. And COVID's providing them an opportunity, not just an opportunity, the necessity of doing so. So because it's something that a lot of schools have been kind of hoping to try for, some of these changes may be permanent. For those of you that are younger and are going to be applying down the line, essays might be more important, extracurriculars, all these sort of softer things might be more important in future years, maybe, possibly, probably. Anybody that tells you that they know exactly what admissions officers are looking for this year in particular is absolutely selling you something. Do not believe them. They are lying. That maybe even includes admissions officers. Most of the admissions officers that I've seen speak to this are basically saying, hey, here's some general guidelines that we're thinking about, but honestly, we're making it up as we go along. And that's good and bad. It means that you don't know as much what to expect. There's probably more stress that's going to be involved. But it also means that if you're not that perfect, shiny apple, flawless student, that you might have an opportunity to get into places that otherwise you might not have had that shot to get into because, test scores are going to matter less, because grades are going to matter less. It provides a lot of opportunities. The one thing that is absolutely the case, all of us are making, as I'm sure you are as well, all of us are kind of just making it up as we go along right now and hoping for the best. And that's it on that cheerful note. If anybody else has any questions, I'd love to hear it. I did get a list of questions. I know I think I hit most of them along the way, but I can try to answer some of those if I pull them up here. But if anybody else has anything that they want to put into the chat, or you can just pipe up, I guess, in the actual video.
So Chris, I just want to say you can go ahead and stop screen sharing.
Yeah, I'm on it right now. Cool. Thank you. Yeah. So does anybody have any further questions right off the bat? If not, I can try to address some that came up that you guys submitted along the way. I think I hit most of these. How long per day should I be studying for the SAT? That's really there's not really like a right answer for that. It depends on what your goals are. And it depends at where you're at in the process. It's obviously better to sort of get in early and to sort of be regular about it. But you got to figure out sort of what you need and how much you want to change your scores. Go in, take a full-length test for practice and see how much you'd like to improve. Start working at it and kind of figure out, well, okay, so like I managed to bump up my score this much in a couple of weeks' time or in a month's time. How much am I going to have to do this to get to where I want to be in time? If you sign up for multiple tests and you end up canceling some of them, is it free of charge? That's an excellent question that I do not know the answer to. I apologize, Prisha. I should know that. It will say on the website, certainly, but I would definitely check on that before I signed up for 10 different exams. If we are not happy with our scores, is it better not to submit them to colleges? So this is a complicated question, particularly this year. So most years it's required for most schools, you got to submit something to colleges. So you kind of gotta. This year, because so many colleges are test optional, if you don't have scores that you love, don't submit them. Significantly, you can choose which colleges you submit your scores to. So one thing that you can do is colleges publish their percentile. They'll publish usually their 25th, 50th, and 75th percentiles for their SATs and ACTs. So they'll tell you like 25% of our students get scores below this, half of our students get scores below and above this, and then 25% get scores above this. If you look at your score and you're like, hey, my score is in that bottom 25th percentile or bottom quartile, don't submit it to that school, assuming that it's not required. If you're in that top quartile, absolutely send it in. And if you're somewhere in the middle, take your best guess as to whether or not you think it's going to help. But there's not like because stuff is not mandatory, you really want to kind of, I'd say certainly if you're even above the median score, you're going to be nudging their median score up, and they like that for the US News and World Report thing. Other questions? How can someone who has a low PSAT score improve their score gradually? So over the long term, which is the easiest way to improve this stuff, is to really focus on your schoolwork, frankly. Pay attention in math class, do all the homework, do the extra problem sets that they give you. Read books that you find challenging. I love getting engrossed in a page turner where you just sort of disappear and you're just in that world and you just live in it, and you just can't wait to see what's happening next. Those sorts of books are not necessarily the books that are going to help you most. The books that are going to help you most are the ones that you kind of got to sit down and kind of work through on a sentence by sentence basis, because those are the ones that are going to challenge you. And the beautiful thing about doing that, it's like lifting weights or any other sort of exercise. The more you do it, the better you're going to get at it, and pretty soon you can just sort of whip through Moby Dick, and it's just like, oh, this is great. Nobody can whip through Moby Dick. It's brutal. I love that book. But the more you work at it, the easier it gets. Over the long term, read a whole lot in your free time. Go in for extra math work. That's the best way to do it in the long term. over the sort of medium to shorter term, the best strategy is to practice with these specific exams. Look, find old tests, go to the resources that are in the link that I sent you that I'm going to resend in a minute. Find those old tests and take them, because that's going to really prepare you for the exam itself, and get you more familiarized with sort of the conventions of the test, the kinds of questions you're likely to see, familiarize you more with the format, all that sort of stuff. How much in advance should I be studying for the SAT? So this is another question that really depends on what your needs are. You know, if you want to go to an Ivy League school, you're going to need something like a perfect score or close to it. You should start studying real darn early, right? But if you are going for if you're going, you know, for a school that is somewhat less stringent in its admissions, maybe your scores are already there or close to it. You might just have to study a little bit. It really depends on what your specific needs are. In order to figure that out, you gotta take a practice test, and you gotta then compare that with what the the median score or the percentile scores from the schools that you're applying to are. Rachel has very helpfully put in the chat, registrations cannot be refunded later than 5 days before the test. So you can get a refund, but you can't do it just beforehand. Canceled registrations are partially refunded. You'll get $10 back, whether you are signed up for the SAT or the SAT with essay. Well, that's really annoying. I wish that were not the case. And I know that people have had trouble getting money back even from tests that have not been canceled, the tests that were canceled due to COVID. And that's just, frankly, a crime. And I don't understand how they're getting away with that. But I don't control those things. We have another question about what's a good PSAT score. So good PSAT score is kind of weird, because your PSAT score really, it doesn't sync up with specific colleges. It's really just whether or not you're going to be qualified for these scholarships, and those scholarships can vary pretty widely. So there's not like a single line. I mean, certainly if you're scoring, you know, over 650 per section, I mean, that's quite good. But it depends what you mean by good, and it really depends on what schools you want to go to down the road. The SAT scores and PSAT scores match up pretty well. So if you look at the scores that are typical of the colleges that you want to apply to and compare them to your PSAT scores are going to be a little bit below that. But if they're in the ballpark, you're probably okay. Again, like what is good and what is bad really depends on what you want to do with it. If your goal is to go to, you know, an Ivy League versus, you know, a good sort of state school, they just have different test requirements, and you're going to need to hit different benchmarks to get into those different places. So what's good for one might not be good for the other, and vice versa. And that's I think all the questions that I didn't cover in my spiel. Does anybody else have any other questions that you would like to put in the chat or pipe up and ask about?